Hey everybody, I'm really excited to introduce a tool that I've developed that my team and I are starting to use with clients that really gets at the heart of how I like to approach my consulting, which is that intersection of finance and the operations pieces and the GTM, but specifically the finance and the ops. And it includes my philosophy of looking at labor, specifically for professional services firms, which labor is usually the biggest line item on the P&L from an expense standpoint, but looking at labor as an asset. So truly looking at your folks as an asset and then thinking about how that asset can generate a return. It looks a little bit like utilization. In fact, it's a lot like hours utilization. But the thing about hours utilization is it doesn't necessarily tell you if any hour that's being invested in client work, let's say, is actually making you any money. So you can look at utilization and say like, hey, I've got somebody who's 80% utilized across accounts and still lose money on everything that person touches. So I've been doing this work for, let's just call it a long time. And it's usually been around buckets of spreadsheets and pivot tables and all kinds of running around. But now I've got this in a tool and I'm really excited to show you. So I'm going to walk you through what this thing is and what it does and how we can use it. So it starts off, this is demo data, but it starts off with just a quick overview. So here's an example of an agency, in this case, that's doing about 3.4 million in revenue. It's got 28 clients and it has a little over 4.6, what I call hidden FTEs. So these are theoretical headcount on the roster for this client that potentially could be harvested. And I'll tell you what I think about that, how to think about that in a minute. So the first visual is hours, budget versus target. And this is really where the whole thing is. And basically, you have a unit line that says, if we think about your team as an asset and a potential yield from that asset, the metrics we're going to start to play around with are things like revenue per head count or burden labor as a percentage of your revenue. And you can get to looking at sort of an average bill rate across your different roles and their individual bill rates. You get to sort of a weighted average bill rate. And using that, we can determine a budget of hours for every client account. So in this case, there's over 28 clients. And anything that is to the right of this sort of unit line, where your target hours are aligned with your actual hours, you're doing pretty good. Now, if you're very much over to the right, you got to think about, am I underservicing this account? Things over here to the left of that line, well, I'm probably running a little hot. And to give you an example, Beacon Analytics, there's an example for us. So the SOW value is 172,000. Their actual hours spent is about 1,800 hours, but their target hours is 771. That's a problem. Now, before anybody starts snickering, I have seen this in the wild. I've seen some pretty gnarly hours variances, but this allows us to see it at a glance. And for me, like this is so helpful in talking to clients and be able to show visually how this stuff works. And of course, the size of the bubble is the relative size of the SOW, so the annual scope value. And then you can kind of see here at a glance, you can look at these hours variances by client. So again, utilization, that anybody might be able to get from an Asana, Reich, whatever, will give you this. I just look at things from a financial lens. That's a little bit more about my background. But when I think of things, it's like, we got this line item, right? So we have all these folks put to work. How much revenue are they generating per hour? How much margin are they generating per hour? How much net are they generating per hour? And what does that mean when we start to think about capacity? So I like to call clients that are completely out of whack problem children. So what I've developed here is what I call sort of almost like a problem score. So as a function of the size of the SOW as well as how far out of alignment the actual hours might be from the target, we get this sort of color scale. So if I want to know where do I want to start, if I'm talking to my client, like, which one of your accounts we want to mess with, it would be like these three, right? So Apex Platform, Beacon Analytics, and Helix Insights. And maybe we can look at the Cloud Bridge and whatnot. And this is super helpful because you could start anywhere. Time is scarce. So where do we want to spend our time? then we can also look at who on the team tends to be running the hottest, who's accumulating a lot of hours. And so we can sort of think about who's leading those projects, how many projects are they on, how many projects are they touching or are they on, what's the total number of SOW value that they're on, and so forth. And here's some examples. So again, if we want to think about our clients, where do we want to start with? We can also start with our people. Now, if you look carefully, the hours variance is negative. So what that means is that we've got folks who might not be servicing their projects enough. I've seen sometimes, and I'm sure you all have as well, where you're coming up on renewal and you do an exercise like this, maybe one-off, and discover that, your hours accumulation is pretty low. So, you're going in to try to justify a renewal and maybe you've been sort of under-servicing. Sometimes that happens. We can look at role mix. I like this chart because depending on the client, you can see by role, so it's around the radial here, the actual versus target. It's just another way to visualize what's going on in these projects by the folks that touch them, the roles that touch them. This is super helpful for trying to diagnose on a project that could be under your gross margin target, or another way to think about that is under or over the hours target or hours allotment for that project, but a lot of people might touch it. So I've seen clients where they have multiple people touching projects as a function of their workflow. So yes, you might be able to determine that a certain client is under your gross margin target, but now how do you start to dig in and diagnose, well, which role, what's going on? Can you pull the harvest and just start hacking at it with the pivot tables, dumping in Claude? Of course you can. This is just a way to visualize it across your whole book of business. And so the way this is set up, which is really cool, which you can kind of select the clients and then the thing refreshes, and then you can drill down. And so, for example, for this client, I can see that for the editor function, my actual target is here, my actual hours is here, but my target is here. And so that's an area to drill down. Let me take a quick pause. I like to think and talk about labor as an asset, and we're investing in that asset, and it has a yield. So it performs like a financial instrument, if you think about it that way. What's my yield on this dollar amount that I'm investing? But this is something for us as decision makers, as executive leaders, to be thinking about. You don't want your teams to feel like they're widgets in a box. That's not at all what the goal is. But the goal is to try to find ways to help your team create more value, which could be maybe help your team argue for more fee. Maybe we're underpricing things, or maybe there's a lot of ad hocs coming at your team from the client. And maybe this can guide us to some really good conversations with team members, let's say this editor, where we learn that, the editor is getting peppered by all these either internal requests or maybe requests from the client. Maybe perhaps it's out of scope. And not every one of these conversations has to lead to, raise the rates. But sometimes, that's necessary. But it also sometimes can lead to conversations around innovation, the role of AI and automation. Maybe there's a lot of things or some things that our team is doing that we can find efficiencies through a very, very focused exercise of aiming our innovative thinkers at a very specific problem that we can identify through a tool like this. A couple more things to highlight that's kind of cool is the hidden FTE concept. So what this means, basically, if we were to look at the team individually or by role and say, if we were to adhere to our hours budgets by client, by role, what percent or how many FTEs could be freed up in that exercise? And so, for the editor role function, we have 1 FTE, that if we can get all the editors to stick to their hours buckets per client that they touch across the entire squad of editors, that's 1 FTE. Why does this become important? A couple of reasons. One is that sometimes, your team might say we need to hire. The team is strapped, and anecdotally, that's true. And you hear it and you see it on your all hands calls and all the rest. But the question is are there efficiencies we can be gained or pursue before we reach for hiring a new person? The other one is, maybe you've got somebody who's overburdened, and maybe if we focus on finding ways to alleviate excess burden, maybe whether it's coming from inside your company or maybe coming from the client, that we can alleviate, get that off that person, that can reduce some heat. You don't want folks burning out. And the last one is thinking about resource forecasting. Do you want to get to zero hidden FTEs? No, you certainly do not, because you need enough sort of grease in the gearbox, if you will, to handle the vagaries of business, right? So people go on vacation, people go on leave, like if folks come, folks go. You need to have enough excess capacity in your system to accommodate all of that. And again, yes, you could look at that from a utilization standpoint, it's critical. But you can also think about that financially, very directly, and that's how this is all being calculated. What I've seen and what I've done personally is try to have 10, 15% slack in your system in general, from a sort of the percent of FTE standpoint. If you're growing really rapidly and you've got a lot of stuff coming at you from BD, maybe 15, 18%, 20% even, depending on your time to fill for certain key roles. But all that can be highlighted from some of these visuals. And when we think about revenue per head count and we kind of look at that, we can come to a visual like this. Now, let's say we wanted to target 240,000 revenue per head count. We see some folks are clearing that bar and some folks aren't. Now, again, one has to be careful how you explain all this and how you show this, or how you talk about it to your broader team, if you choose to do so at all, because you don't want people to feel like there's a cut line, right? Like anybody below this line, anybody in red is going to get fired. That's exactly what you don't want. So this definitely has to be handled with care. I would say similar to a utilization calculation, but now you're talking about money, and people might get understandably nervous about that. But as executives, as business leaders, as we're thinking about this, what could we be doing to help these folks be more sort of value driving in the work that they're doing? Now, the answer could be these are new folks and they're not fully loaded yet. That's perfectly fine. The answer could be that they're on a lot of lower SOW value clients, and we got to think about that. But the point is, now we're seeing the data, we're seeing the impact on the financials, and now we can look to see what we can do about it. Now, I will tell you, if you look at these folks who are well under the revenue per headcount target, and they seem to be strapped, you look at their harvest data, their timekeeping data, and they're booking a lot of hours, then the question is, what are they working on? And that, again, can lead to higher level, more specific conversations you can have with their supervisors or their managers, or with them directly, depending on the size of the business. And once again, I'll reiterate it. The goal is not to create a cut line. That's not what this is about. This is about finding ways to empower your team and help guide them to activities and behaviors on their clients where they can be driving more value given what you're paying them. Okay. So to round this out, coming back up to the top, we have our target hours per client. So that's all well and good. So I was like, all right, Larry, this makes sense, but how do I know how much time should be devoted to these things by bucket, by role? Well, that's what this chart tells us. And if you've got your scope of work value, then you have an allocation. And where is this coming from? We look at your existing timekeeping data, and historically we look at what percentage for each client in aggregated, how much time is on a percent basis is allotted to each role for across all the book of business. Is that perfect? Absolutely not. And even using the concept of a single blended bill rate has its own challenges, and this is something I learned the hard way, is that a project that you might be using a sort of a standard average bill rate at 190,000 could be different than 94,000 or different than 360. And especially in my experience, it will be different at 360. What I learned is, and it's not universal, but this is just my experience, is that if you use a lower price point project to do this calculation and come up with a standard bill rate for your pricing, it could break down with bigger projects, because you might discover that a bigger project tends to use more on a percentage basis of total hours, more junior talent on that project than, say, a $94,000 project. And that will screw things up if you're using the same blended bill rate for both. So is this perfect? It is not. I call this sort of the lo-fi, the low fidelity way of doing it. Hi-fi would be if we had a ground up pricing calculator built so that every client from the ground up, from by deliverable, by analysis, et cetera, we're establishing by role what those hours should be, and then that becomes the goalpost of the yardstick that we use for every single one of these clients. This can accommodate that, but the way I tend to approach things is, if I had to parachute into a client and I don't know anything about anything, and the client doesn't have that sort of high fidelity setup in place, this gets me a good place to start. It allows me to have a great conversation quickly, and then we can always build from here. So this is where we get those hours budgets, and the way this is used is basically to say, I'll pick one, let's take Crestline IO. It's like, okay, across 12 months, the budget for the account manager is 76 hours. How can we make that happen? How closely can we get to 76 hours? And that's how you do that. And those conversations are great. And again, they can lead to innovation. They can lead to ways to sort of tighten up SOWs, or having, different conversations with clients. If maybe, which happens, clients might be peppering your folks with ad hoc requests that tend to add up. Okay. And then lastly, there's a config view here that just tells you some underlying docs that are being pulled, and then also target role mix and bill rates. So this is coming from that corpus of timekeeping data. And so looking at that, this is the mix based on where the clients have been. Now you might say, hey, if you have to improve things, is it good to use this as a yardstick because maybe things are out of whack? And that would be absolutely right. And again, the thought is, well, two things. One, this gets updated every month. So every month that we get new data in, we go back trailing 12 or annualize newer projects. And then so that'll sort of accommodate shifts over time. But also, again, assuming coming in hot, don't know exactly where to start. If you ascribe to like, hey, we got to hustle and something is better than nothing, this is the approach. And so again, this gives us a place to start. And down here, you could see where the blended bill rates are coming from. In this particular case, the target rate's 223. If everything hit its hours budgets, that would imply about a 69% gross margin, which ain't bad. And this shows you how the different elements in the blended bill rate stack up based on who the folks are and their own incremental components of the overall blended rate. Talk a little about how the problem score methodology works, and then how a couple other elements of this analysis are constructed, and you're done. Wanted to show this to everybody. I'm super excited about it. It's now being put into the heart of every one of my client projects. So for me and my team, we're using this tool for all of our clients, where we're looking at operations and efficiency across client profitability and team member financial productivity. So I hope you found that interesting. I get geeked out about this stuff. I've been doing this for years and years, and I'll tell you, this is the tool I wish I had when I was leading teams on the agency side and looking at teams of 60 and 70 and across a couple different divisions, doing a lot of this by hand, manually. And now I'm happy to report that I built a tool that can help me get to this very rapidly for my clients. All right, take care. Enjoy.